Hello everybody, welcome to today's webinar session. It is the second session of our Designing Predictable and Compliant IT Services webinar series. It is Overcoming Challenges in Your ITSM Journey. My name is Alexander Mazurek with Quint Wellington Redwood, and I'll be your host during today's session. Quint is a global consulting firm dedicated to the improvement of IT's value to the business. We're happy to say that this year we'll be celebrating our 25th anniversary. We started in 1992 in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, but have expanded to be a completely global company. We have over 250 consultants now operating in 49 countries around the globe. Our core business practices include sourcing, architecture, governance, lean IT, service management, of course, and DevOps. For the last 3 years, we're proud to say that the IOP has ranked us as a top global advisor on sourcing and governance in the areas of client satisfaction, delivery excellence, and innovative programs. And last off, we do consider ourselves, and we always put out new content in the areas of IT service management, lean IT, and DevOps. Now, as I mentioned, this is the second session of our Designing Predictable and Compliant IT Services series. Last week, we covered Achieving Customer-Centric IT Service Management. Our colleague Tice covered that. Many of you who, if you did join that session in with us today, we're glad to see you back. And next week will be the conclusion of this series, exactly a week from today, and that is creating your ITSM business case. And our colleague Adrian will be covering that for us. Now I want to introduce our speaker today, who is Brian. Brian is a senior consultant with us. He's an ITSM expert. We're very proud to have him. I'm going to hand things over to him now. Brian, thank you for joining us today.
All right, thanks, Alex. Welcome, everybody. Good day. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'm going to dive right into this so that we can be sure and save some time at the end for your questions. And as Alex said, make sure you put those questions into the question box, and we'll try to carve out a few minutes at the end and make sure we get to those questions. So one of the key questions we get asked by our clients is, how do they start their journey in ITSM? How to get it going, how to keep the momentum, and where do you decide to start? What are some of the practices for determining where to start? So I'm going to try to get to that in today's agenda. So just to kind of go over what I'm going to cover. We're going to start with discussing some ideas on how to impartially assess your current situation. And there's some ideas around some tools that are out there in the public domain, but establish that baseline of where are we today so that you can make some good data-driven decisions around how to move forward. Then we'll talk about identifying where some of the key gaps may be, determining some of the most impactful areas for improvement, and then how do you prioritize those improvements? What's some good practices around prioritization so that you go for the good stuff? I'll also make some suggestions around building a roadmap to begin those improvements and how to move forward. You need to take into account things like availability of resources, your organization's ability to absorb change. We'll address project planning and some of the importance of utilizing the good project management disciplines around implementation of the changes. It's always a good idea to have some structure around how you're going to implement. And then finally, and probably one of the key issues that we want to make sure we talk about is, how do you rally and track your stakeholder support? Who are your stakeholders? How do you manage their support and maintain the momentum? Because we don't do this stuff in a bubble. We need our constituents to be on board with us. So that's the agenda. So one of the first things that we determine when we work with our clients is the clients need a clear and honest assessment. We need a snapshot of the current processes and the maturity levels within the organization so we can start the journey. So one of the other questions is, how do we rank compared to the industry standards out there? And how do you determine where you are today and establish that baseline? One of the things we can do is there's the opportunity to do a self-assessment. You want to make sure that you're doing an honest self-assessment. You want to determine where are we today, as I said earlier, and then how can we improve on where we need to move forward. So a good analogy is, on a personal level, if you decide that you want to reduce your travel costs, your commuting costs, what you might want to consider is, what's it costing you today? You need to start out with, okay, how much am I paying today? Is my automobile giving me good return on the cost of fuel, either kilometers or miles per gallon? and where are we today? We need that starting point. So what's it costing me to commute today? And then I might make some decisions around, okay, do I need a new vehicle? Do I need to upgrade my vehicle? Do I need to move to public transportation? But it's really hard to make that decision until you understand exactly what your situation is today. So that's what we're talking about here, is establishing that first baseline of where we're at. If you're going to do an internal audit, the struggle is usually to find a way to do it impartially. Personal perceptions come to play, emotions come to play, and so it can be done. There are some tools out there, and I've listed some of those at the bottom. I'll talk a little bit more about a couple of those. It can be done, but again, it needs to be something that you do impartially. And then one of the things that I don't want to see people, that I really coach folks not to get hung up on, is as you're doing these assessments, don't get hung up so much on the score. The score is less important than what you're going to bubble up in terms of where are the gaps and where do we get started. So some people, they get so wrapped around the fact that we're only at a maturity level X and we want to get to this level, and they don't really realize that you need to really drill down into those details underneath that score. That's really the critical part, especially to get started. So some of the tools that I would like to just talk briefly about. There's something called CMMI. You may be familiar with this, the Capability Maturity Model. CMMI Institute provides some guidance on measuring organizational maturity, and so you can see there's the 5 levels. Level 1 being the starting point. That's where organization is very reactive, typically doing a lot of firefighting. There's not a lot of predictability or consistency in the way that problems and issues are addressed. Level 2, you start to move into managed processes, but you're typically managing on the project level, and again, you're often very reactive if you're a level 2 organization. Level 3 is where you start to see some good traction around organization, and you start to move towards more proactive and less reactive, and that's where we really start to see things like good documentation, good process discipline. At level 4, then you start to see where people are actually using data and measuring the output of their processes, and that's where you start to see more control around the processes at level 4. And then at level 5 is where an organization is optimizing, and they're really focusing on process improvements. So they've gained good traction around those first 4 levels. Now, organizations, again, get hung up around the scoring. Organizational maturity is different than process level maturity, and we typically find that most organizations have various processes at different levels of maturity, and that's where we start to drill down into the next scorecard that I have used in the past successfully, and that's the ISO 20000 standards. ISO is the International Standards Organization. They're based out of Switzerland. All of their collateral is available on the public domain for a small fee. If you're at all interested, I recommend you go download, pay the small fee and download the standards. I've used it as a scorecard in the past with organizations. Now, ultimately with ISO, understand that the goal is typically certification. The ultimate goal is to get certified. And that may be something that your organization is or is not interested in. If you are interested in it, I would say that you're making a big investment in your organization, because typically ISO certification is not cheap. And in order to be ISO standard certified, you have to be able to answer yes to all the questions. And there are over 200 questions in the ISO 20000 standard. However, that doesn't mean that you can't use that as a scorecard and help baseline where you're at today in your various processes. The nice thing that I like about the ISO 20000 scorecard, other than the fact that I'm certified in it, have done a lot of work around ISO as an auditor, it aligns nicely with the ITIL standards. It really takes the ITIL guidance and applies it in a way that is a good way of assessing where you stand against the ITIL standards. Whether you're using CMMI or ISO, the thing that you really want to get to, again, is don't get hung up around the score. What you want to look at is where are those questions that you are answering no to, that you're negatively answering when you do your self-assessment. So if I move to the next slide, this very small print, which I apologize for, but it's really just to show a sampling. This is a completely made-up score on my part. I built a scoring spreadsheet really just to take a look at how an organization would answer these questions that are posed to you in the ISO standards. And then what you're really interested in are, again, those questions that you're answering negatively. So there are several things in there that you will see if you look on that scorecard that we've answered no to. And those would be areas that you would look at and go, all right, is this something that is going to add value to my organization? Is this something we should be doing? And again, this is a tool for helping you to bubble up those areas where you may have gaps in the delivery of your services. So in this particular one, I'm showing incident and problem management, two of the probably more critical processes that we work with customers a lot on. And again, you're just looking for those questions that you know for a fact you're not doing. If you're answering yes to this, the assumption is that you are doing it, you're measuring it, you're documenting it, and you're managing to the disciplines around it. So again, you have to be honest with yourself. Are we really doing all those things? One of the things that's very important when you're using this scorecard with ISO is it's binary. You're either doing it or you're not. And so what that tells you is the what. It doesn't tell you the how. Now there is other guidance out there available on the ISO website, as well as with some of the other process standards and practices that will help get you to the what, and I'm sorry, will help get you to the how. But really, this is just an exercise that you go through to determine what is it that we're doing well, what is it that we're not doing well, and where are those areas that we should go focus on first. So at Quint, we have worked with hundreds of organizations around the globe, and we're one of those organizations that can bring a good third-party view on outside assessment. And the way we do that is we help to make data-driven decisions. We do interviews with staff, we do interviews with management, we'll even interview customers and suppliers if the client so desires. And we'll look at the documentation, we'll look at the reporting, and we'll give a clear assessment as to where we feel an organization stands. As you can see, one of the outputs here is this heat map. Our tool is called the Quint Quest that we do assessments with, and this particular heat map is a current state, and this is an actual customer that we've worked with in the past, and this is showing what the maturity level is of that organization when we did the first assessment. You can tell that it's fairly critical, and this is actually not atypical for organizations that we work with. But the thing that I really just want to show you here is if you look at the color coding of this and just kind of make mental note of it, because I'm going to show you another slide downstream for the same client that kind of shows you how we try to target improvements. But this is really just, again, this is mapping to the ITIL processes, and we're showing an honest and straightforward and impartial assessment as to where this particular client was when we first walked in the door. Now, as always, the old saying, the devil's in the details. And so what we also do as part of the Quint Quest is we will make recommendations. We'll first look at where are the key process areas that this particular organization sees as being important to them. I don't believe that you would ever go into a project and say, we're going to do everything from beginning to end, and we're going to map every single process until we get to a maturity level 5. That would be a big investment, and that's not typically what we're trying to do. What we want to do is bubble up those areas that are going to be most valuable to the organizations that you serve, to your clients, and then break down the details underneath that, and we will make recommendations around project planning for how you could move forward to move the organization forward across the different process areas. And one of the things that we also try to do is we want to help the organization identify where the gaps are and where the best opportunities are and how to close those gaps. So just some bullet points here on some guidance on how to do that. First, you need to identify and document the critical weaknesses or where you see the deficiencies. Also, where are the strengths? Every organization has strengths and weaknesses. So where are areas that we can maybe apply best practices that have been used successfully in the organization, but make those more consistent across the other practices and processes? You need to be honest. We don't sugarcoat it, but we're not overly critical. Again, we look for strengths and weaknesses. It's important that you look across all the key process areas and all the key services. The operative word there being key. The ones that are going to be most valuable to your clients and the organizations that you serve. Understanding that there are interdependencies across process areas and across the services. You also want to make sure that you include suppliers and partners wherever they might be delivering to your key services. You need to, again, be realistic. Don't overreach. You're not going to be able to solve everything in a day, so you need to try to avoid the scope creep. Again, focus, focus, focus. Consider the culture of the organization. Some organizations can pivot, some are slow to pivot. Consider the size of the organization, and then when you're looking at those key areas, understand the relevance to your clients within those process and service areas. And once again, don't get overly concerned with the scores. What you really want to do is you want to identify the gaps. What you will find is as you start to address those gaps, the scores will just naturally rise. Okay, so then you need to get down to some focus. You want to focus on the areas that are going to be the most impactful. You want to try to bubble up the top X services, whatever that number is, 3 to 5 typically. You want to consider the resource constraints, considering that like most projects, some of your key resources have day jobs and you've got to plan accordingly. Identify the low-hanging fruit. Get some quick wins. You want to be visible with your wins. Make sure that you get the business involved in your decision making. You want to make sure that that they understand the relevance and the impact for them, the business and any of their clients that you might be serving. Engage the relevant stakeholders, and I'm going to talk about that a little more upstream. Communicate. Make sure that you do things like project dashboards, newsletters, things like that. Try to keep it in front of people that these initiatives are ongoing. Make sure that you get the appropriate level of organizational support. That includes top-down, bottom-up, and everything in the middle. And again, I'll talk about stakeholder management in a few slides. And then finally, you want to socialize, advertise, and celebrate as your successes are happening. Make sure that you give credit to the various players. Make sure you bring them into the conversation at the right point and make them part of the celebration. Now, I showed you that earlier slide with the heat map. This is the same organization that we worked with. This is an 18-month plan that we developed for them. So you can see how the colors have changed. And this is the 18-month, and truth be told, there were 6-month incremental heat maps that we developed as well. So this is how we start to break this down into, these are the areas we're going to focus on. We've already broken down through our recommendations and our assessment what are the individual areas that we're going to address within each of these, and then we start to move the organization forward. And this is our goal. This is where we want to get them to in 18 months if we're working with an organization. So this is something that we highly recommend that you want to look at. The key thing is that, again, this is 18 months. This is an investment. You're not going to get to this level of maturity in a day. And then one of the things that we want to do is break it down even further into roadmaps. This particular roadmap is something I would consider to be more of a big bang roadmap, because you can see that this is a very aggressive schedule. This is really trying to move things forward quickly. This organization is going to be making a big investment in resources because there's a lot of processes here. They're happening in a cascading fashion very quickly. So that's one way of building a roadmap, is just looking at individual process areas, prioritization around those, again, using those breakdowns and those details that we've outlined in the gapping exercise. Another approach is a phased approach. Organizations will do this a lot. So it gives you a chance between each phase to kind of stop, take a breath, reassess, and typically what you plan for the next set of phases is going to adjust based on organizational change and based on success or lack of success in your early phases. So there may be some spillover, there may be some stuff that you move downstream, but the phased approach is, I think, a nice way to do a sanity check over certain periods of time. So one of the key takeaways, though, is that you need to treat these initiatives as projects. They need the rigor and the discipline that you get around projects. You need to track the task, you need to track the resources. Just like any other project, it's not going to be successful unless you give it that level of attention and you really break it down into those specific process areas that we've identified and the underlying areas of concern and how we're going to build out the improvements in those process areas. And if your organizations use agile, that could be used as well. That's the more iterative approach. It can be broken down into agile project planning just as easily as waterfall. But the bottom line, and I think the key takeaway, is whatever project discipline you're using, you need to integrate that into your process and service improvements as you move forward. So to talk about the all-important stakeholders here, you need to identify who your key stakeholders are. That would be defined by things like, are they affected by the change in the outputs? Are they going to be teams or individuals that maybe own all or part of your implementation or your process improvements? Are there decision makers that you need to keep track of? Are there people that can influence the success or not of the project? Any other interested parties? You need to make sure that you have a key understanding of who those key stakeholders are. It's good to get some change agents on board, people that are going to rally with you, that understand the value of it, identify who they are. Then there's the old project management acronym of WIFM, what's in it for me? It's important that you look at it from their perspective, understand what they have to gain, or what there might be to lose. There could be that there's new responsibilities or responsibilities being taken away. There may be new resources, new controls, or again, there could be loss of resource and controls, new tasks that need to be assigned or taken away. There could be some title or privilege, decision-making capabilities. All of those things are things that you need to consider that may be gained or lost by your key stakeholders as you identify who they are. Now, one of the tools that I've used successfully, and I've seen different iterations of this, this is just kind of my version of how I track stakeholders. One of the things that I try to do is I try to identify and keep track of the support or not. You could do this by name or by role, depending on the size of the project. You might want to work on a team level. But if you have a smaller project or you have enough resources that you can get to the individual level, then you would list them on here. You want to understand how are they going to be impacted at a high level, high, medium, or low. Is this going to impact them? Do they stand to gain or lose, or both? What change behavior do you need? What is it that you're asking them to do that might be different, or that may be just a change in the way that they're doing things today? And then I try to keep track of what I think their stance is. And this evolves over time. I try to identify what are the benefits, the WIFM, for these particular stakeholder or group of stakeholders. And then what's my plan to mitigate should they stray or should their stance change? One of the key things that you need to do is you need to obviously go talk to them. You can't make assumptions. It's really important that you go have those conversations. It might be that you join a staff meeting if it's a team that you're working with and get on their agenda on a regular basis. It might be that you just simply schedule individual time with them. But either way, it's really important that you spend some time with them and have a two-way conversation. You want to take notes and plan your actions around their concerns. And then I typically try to revisit this matrix at least once a month depending on the size and cadence of the project because, again, they're going to change. This is very subjective, and as you go through the project, you're going to find that their response is going to change. A few examples here, you can see that I've got the network manager identified as somebody who needs to give us more detailed documentation so that we can do better problem management for them. And so what are we going to do? We're going to go talk to them and get into their staff meetings. The second line, that's a typo. It should say security team manager. Apologies for that. But the same thing. You're looking for the same actions and expecting the same results from that team. And then the service desk, they may be actually looking to to lose something, because there may be that you're going to be taking some work away from them. So how are you going to mitigate that? Well, you're going to try to bring them into the process design potentially. You might work with them about shifting some of their resources over to other areas that can add value, like knowledge capture. So this is just an example of how you might use a tool like this to keep track of your stakeholder support. So how do you make sure that you're getting through to your stakeholders? The first one is obviously actively engage. Go to the meetings, talk to them. Make sure that you're listening. So my dear old dad always had an adage that he used that I am constantly reminding myself of, and that is, if your lips are moving, your ears are not working. And I can't tell you the number of times he said that to me. And it's very true. So when you go in, engage, make sure that you're actively listening to the feedback that you're getting from your stakeholders and keep them engaged. Directly address their concerns. Try to negotiate, find neutral ground. If you're getting some resistance, try to work for an area of neutral ground that you can work with them on. Make sure that you're looking at the benefits, the WIFMs from their perspective. Again, communicate, communicate, communicate. You might show some flexibility by considering their feedback and maybe adjusting accordingly. That always is a good way to win support, if you show that you're willing to make adjustments. And then if you have to, you might need to go to leadership to help you mitigate the resistance. Ask them to lean in, show the support, articulate why we're doing it, articulate the requirements, and make sure that leadership is on board with communicating that this is being done with your stakeholders and not to your stakeholders. So how do you make sure you keep engaged with your key stakeholders? Again, communicate, transparency, make sure you're doing project planning and updating on a regular basis. Communicate or bring them in as appropriate for the design and impact analysis. Have them participate in the tool changes. Inevitably, there's going to be adjustments or configuration changes in the tools that may be needed for the process design work that you're going to be doing. So it's good to bring them in. Maybe invite them in for some user acceptance testing. Invite them in for conversations about measures and metrics and reporting. Make sure that you recognize and celebrate with them, and bring them into the discussion about ongoing improvements. Now, just a little segue to the next session before we open it up for questions here. Our associate Adrian is going to be talking next week about measures and metrics. And so you'll probably see this slide or something very close to it again with him. But one of the things that we want to make sure we discuss with you is, how do you measure success? And how do you measure that success so that it's relevant to the business? So this is a tool that we use that's called a KPI tree, or a metrics tree. And this is something that we use to try to make sure that the things that we're measuring within our processes and services in IT is also being relevant, pointing to the relevance within the business and how it's going to benefit the business. So I'm not going to go into detail here. Adrian's going to do a fantastic job in a week to really delve into that for you. One final thought. This is one of my most overused quotes. Accredited to President Kennedy, although it is an old Siemens quote, and that is, a rising tide raises all ships. So what you're going to find is, as you start to identify those 3 to 5 initial initiatives that you start to go forward with, and you start to implement your roadmap, there's going to be a natural progression of everything is going to start to improve. You're going to see it across the board. So you need to remember to recognize the people that are contributing, celebrate the wins. There is going to be setbacks. I promise you there will be inevitable setbacks. Don't let that derail all of your efforts. Realize that this is a hard work, this is an investment, but with the right focus and the right support, you will get the WIFMs and the benefits that you're looking for. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to kick it now back to my associate Alex, and he's going to bring forward any questions that you all may have. Alex?
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. That was a great presentation. And we did get a couple during the presentation, so we'll start off with the first one, which is, which of the ITIL processes would you recommend as a starting point?
Great question, and one we hear often, and a bit of a loaded question, because the answer is, it depends. And I know that's not a good answer, but It really does depend on where you're at with the organization and what the assessment tells you. However, I will say that in my opinion, I think there's what I consider to be the big four. The first one is incident management. Obviously, you need to be able to keep the systems and the services up and running. The second one would be problem management, because you need to be able to do that root cause analysis and get to eradicating those problems that are bringing you those incidents. The third one is change management, because we all know that change introduces risk, and with risk comes opportunity for failure. And so good discipline around change management is critical. And then the fourth one might be one that most people, I think, don't really consider as a priority, but I think it is, and that is catalog management. Because you really need to define what it is your organization does, but equally what you don't do. You've got to set those boundaries. You've got to be able to focus on those key areas that you're good at delivering to, and make sure that you're delivering those key services at the right level before you start to stretch. Over delivery can be just as dangerous as under delivery. You need to find the sweet spot, and I think the way that's done is through good catalog definition and catalog management. But thanks for the question.
Okay. And the question we have here, he asks, can we discuss some supporting tools here? So I think he's asking for what would be some good supporting tooling.
Tooling, there's all kinds of stuff. If we're talking specifically about things like ticketing tool for incident management, there are some obviously some good tools. I would go look at the Magic Quadrant that's out there by the name escapes me right now, but the organization calls it the Magic Quadrant. And there are lots of tools that are out there. Obviously, most of them are moving to cloud-based. So some of the tools that are out there, one that we like at Quint is a tool called Sharewell. There's another one out there that's starting to get a lot of traction called ServiceNow. And both of those tools are built around the ITSM best practices. And so with the tool, what you're trying to do is you're trying to drive the discipline of behavior. One thing I would say about tooling is don't let the tools drive the process. It needs to be the other way around. You need to have the good process discipline, and that needs to drive your requirements for your tooling. I've seen too many organizations that go out and get so wrapped up in their tooling, and then they turn around and say, okay, we have to change our process to adhere to the tool, and that's backwards. Start with process discipline, get that documented, get that improving, then move to, okay, now we have the good requirements, and the tool will help drive the discipline around the process, but not the other way around.
In the interest of time, I think we'll go ahead and make that the final question for today. So there's a few things I just want to cover with everybody before we sign off. Is I want to remind you that next week is the conclusion where our colleague Adrian will be covering creating your ITSM business case. We'll also be going over some of the metrics and whatnot that support progress and everything like that. So that is next week at the exact same time. And I also want to remind everybody that Brian here is an expert with us, and I know in 30 minutes in a webinar, that might not be enough time to cover everything that you may have wanted to get out of this session. He is available using the following contact methods. You can reach out to us. You can request to talk to him directly. I know he'd love to chat with you about your current situation, how it may relate to any of the topics he talked about today, or just about anything with ITSM Idle, and that's right up his alley. So those are the methods to contact us. We're active on just about every single social media channel. You can find us there to register for webinars in the future, our content releases, white papers, blog posts, and things of that nature. I want to thank you everyone again for joining us today. Brian, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. I hope the rest of your day is great. Have a good one.